little preliminary announcement, and that is, again, I don't know what's going to happen with these syllabuses, but there is an order sheet for them, and I see everybody's, not everybody, but they've been exhausted, and I have some more. And on that order sheet are the newer books, the Oxford Group book, the syllabus, and the Hope book. And on the other one is the set of 10. And so there are 2 sets of order sheets. And I have some cards, but if you want to keep in touch with me, and I sure hope you do, nothing blesses me more than to get a phone call or an email or a fax. And I'm not much of an internet guy, but I do check my email. And please feel free to keep in touch, because a lot of, just right here, I've gotten a copy of The Sanctuary of the Soul, which was one of the early books, and Mary's going to dig up a runner's Bible and so forth. And so there's a lot of value in keeping in communication. And on those order sheets is my address, my phone number, my fax number, my email, and my homepage on the internet. And so there are a lot of ways of getting in touch with me if you have that information. So I hope you'll take an order sheet, and it would be lovely if you ordered, but whether you do or you don't, it's a good way of having a way of communicating with me with my latest address. I also hope that if those syllabuses come, they're $14.95, and they will have, as you can see, that's what I'm using here is my copy of that, and they will have the materials that we covered. And now and then, of course, I throw in some other stuff, but you'll have a record of what I considered to be important when I was putting this together. And so, for example, you will have the reference to the steps, you will have a reference to the Oxford Group and the steps, and you'll have the reference of Ann Smith to the steps. And if what happens, I think, as time goes on, there will be more and more people straying farther and farther away from AA history, and I hope I'll be getting closer and closer to it. And you, as some of you, as message carriers, will want to be able to know, how can I pass this on? How can I be a sponsor? How can I do a big book study and work in the history? And that, as I said, if I live long enough, and I already got the invitation, but when I come back next year, we'll have another little syllabus on how to study in conjunction with the big book. And this is almost satisfactory as is, but I'm trying it out with my sponsees just to see how it works, and then we'll put it together. Okay, the topic of the next segment, remember now, we've covered the spiritual beginnings, which began with Dr. Bob's childhood, and then began in Akron and began in Switzerland, and culminated in the experiment in Akron, which culminated in the big book. And I threw in my opinion that AA is neither spiritual nor religious, because it doesn't make any difference. But if you wanted to characterize spirituality, it's dependence upon the Creator. Then we covered the biblical roots of AA, which I hope I will leave with you more significantly than any other root, because it's the core root. The Oxford Group, Sam Shoemaker, Ann Smith, all got their ideas from the Bible. And the second major root was the Oxford Group, simply because it had a structure for life-changing, which has been incorporated almost word for word into Alcoholics Anonymous. We haven't left the Oxford Group. We're right in the middle of it. What's left is the Oxford Group has left AA, if you want to put it correctly. But the leading and most articulate spokesman for the Oxford Group, certainly in America, was the Reverend Sam Shoemaker. And how did Bill get together with this guy? Well, we'll cover that a little bit. But, and I think it's been overrated, because as they point out and pass it on, Bill would usually say, we got our ideas from the Oxford Group as led by Sam Shoemaker in America. Well, he wasn't the leader, but he certainly wrote more books than any Oxford Group person, and he was much more in touch with Bill's friends although it's very clear from Lois Wilson's Oxford Group notes and her journals that Bill and Lois went to Oxford Group house parties, and they went to Oxford Group meetings continually, and that they met a lot of people that were very closely connected with Frank Buchman, including Frank Buchman, and some of the people I mentioned in my books. They didn't meet Jim Houck because Jim Houck was not a leader in the Oxford Group. But they met my friend Jim Newton, who was, and his wife Ellie, who wrote practically one of the earliest Oxford Group books, and she's still alive. And Lois mentions these people, and Ann Smith mentions Eleanor Ford by name in her notes. And so there was a lot of connection between Oxford Group people that had nothing particularly to do with Shoemaker. They met Garth Lean, who was from London. They met Loudon Hamilton, who was from Scotland. And so, even though they might not have wanted to talk much about it, Bill and Lois Wilson met those Oxford Group people, and they spent lots of time with Roland Hazard. And they spent time with Shep Cornell. When I see these invitations to Oxford Group house parties, they always had a whole list of distinguished people that were sponsoring them. And Shepard Cornell was always on those lists. And that's the guy that Lois and Bill and Ebby hung out with. So there was a very close connection, and Shoemaker's personal journals made it clear by his mentioning Bill Wilson by name. Bill Wilson was given a big task in the Oxford Group. When the Prime Minister of Norway, who was also the President of the League of Nations, came to America, they gave Bill the job of contacting the American businessmen. Bill was an Oxford Group team member. So there was a much closer connection with the Oxford Group than anybody wants to admit today. But there also was a close connection with Sam Shoemaker. And because all of these documents have been lifted from the Episcopal archives, and if they're in New York, that's one thing I won't say that they have not let me see, but now that my friend Frank M. is gone, I don't know. But they may be in New York, but I saw them in the apartment of somebody who shouldn't have had them. And as far as I know, that's a lot of valuable material on the close association. And as long as that remains not available, it's possible for people to discount Sam Shoemaker's influence, but Bill Wilson didn't. Here's what Bill said in the language of the heart, for example. For every river has a wellspring at its source. AA is like that too. In the beginning there was a spring which poured out of a clergyman, Dr. Samuel Shoemaker, way back in 1934. Now remember, Bill Wilson just got sober in December of 1934. Way back in 1934, he began to teach us the principles and attitudes that afterward came to full flower in AA's 12 Steps for Recovery. Furthermore, in a letter from Wilson to Shoemaker in 1963, excuse me, he said to Sam, the 12 steps of AA simply represented an attempt to state in more detail, breadth, and depth what we have been taught primarily by you. Without this, there could have been nothing at all. Though I wish the co-founder tag had never been hitched to any of us, I have no hesitancy in adding your name to the list. Now, is that baloney? Well, let's look at the facts. If he'd been dealing with specifics, Bill could have said a lot more. It's fair to say that Sam Shoemaker wrote, spoke about, and taught about just about every item in the Bible, the devotionals, and the Oxford Group that you've been listening to for the last day. The Oxford Group and the Shoemaker books are one and the same. They all talked about the same thing. They weren't talking about different things. There's no difference between the Oxford Group and Sam Shoemaker. None. Zero. Zilch. Sam wrote over 30 books, and somebody found another one for me in Pittsburgh, so it's up to 33 now. But and a lot of sermons and articles and pamphlets, and I've been gathering them, and I've still got, there's some beautiful stuff. God's Will and My Life Work and A First Century Christian Fellowship. I keep finding them. And Sam had a circle of clergymen that Bill knew well. Who were they? Well, they were Ray Purdy. They were Irving Harris. They were Frank Buchman. There were a number of other people, John Potter Kyler Jr., Jack Smith. All these people were connected with the Oxford Group headquarters at Calvary House, which was right next door to the church, and where Sam Shoemaker lived. So Sam was living in the same quarters as Frank Buchman, and their headquarters was there, and they had printing presses and a book room and all this good stuff. Bill Wilson was closeted with Sam Shoemaker in Sam's book-lined office, which I have seen, and it is book-lined, many times between 1934 and 1939. I've had one eminent historian say it's not so. Why would anybody want to lie about that? That was stated in a typewritten memorandum that Sam Shoemaker's assistant minister's wife, Julia Harris, that Bill credited publicly in articles, gave to me. And she said, Dick, this is eyewitness. I know Irving, meaning her own husband's, way of writing. And that's what he said. Shoemaker mentions Wilson by name. This was so exciting to me because everybody was trying to say these two men had nothing to do with each other until many years later. Come on. I mean, Sam Shoemaker was writing down messages from God in his journal, and I've seen them. So has my son. I have copies of them. They were given to me by Shoemaker's daughters, and it mentions, met Bill Wilson today. Talked to Bill Wilson today. Bill is working on this deal with Hambro today. And those weren't messages from God, because the Oxford Groupers did a lot of strange things with their journals. They'd put down, be sure to get the laundry today. And I don't think that was from God. It was from Helen Shoemaker. Put the garbage out, Whatever came, they wrote down. And so it's fascinating. And those, unfortunately, after 1936 to 39, those journals are missing. But they weren't stolen. Nikki just can't find them, and she's busier than the Dickens. And if I live long enough, maybe we'll see them. But I've seen enough. It's the old evidentiary principle. If you get enough of the pieces together, if the glove doesn't fit, you gotta acquit. And, okay? So, furthermore, Sam Shoemaker contributed several articles to the Grapevine. And they're great articles. Those 12 steps, as I understand them, the spiritual angle. There are about 5 Grapevine articles, and you'll find those in my Shoemaker book. And when it's revised, you'll still find them in my Shoemaker book. And also, Sam Shoemaker was asked to speak to the AA convention in St. Louis with a Roman Catholic priest, Father Dowling. And when Dowling kicked the bucket, in the next convention in Long Beach, Sam Shoemaker was asked to speak with a Monsignor in the Catholic Church from the Los Angeles area. So Bill must have thought something about him, because I can't remember very many other people that were asked to speak from the cloth. In fact, today they won't even let him in the door. And so, Sam was a big person in Bill's eyes after he once got established. The 40s stunk for Bill. He had a deep depression. And those were bad years for AA. Take it from Nell Wing. She told me so. She said, Dick, those were just awful. Bill used to sit in the office and burn holes in the desk and sit there depressed and so forth. Those were not the rosy years. And Dr. Bob was alive, and they were very rosy in Akron. Sister Ignatia and he were working on 5,000 drunks. And Bill Wilson was trying to get out of a deep depression. But when Bill got himself back together and Dr. Bob was dead, then a lot of historical gathering and stuff began. Now, I hope I have said enough. I don't want to just keep beating this horse, but Bill Wilson got a lot of stuff from Sam Shoemaker directly. Both of them said so. Sam Shoemaker wrote a letter to Bill when Bill was 60 days sober, telling him what a great job he'd done with this chemistry professor, Frederick B. And the guy is mentioned in AA literature, and it's remarkable that Sam was giving Bill a pat on the back when Bill was only 60 days sober. He never got the chemistry professor sober any more than he got anybody else sober until he got with Dr. Bob. But the point is, Sam was egging him on. Go for it, Bill. Go for it. You're doing great. And so there was that angle. And all these other people, many of names that I've seen in Lois Wilson's journal, and I've seen them in lists and Shoemaker's journals, the association was close. Now, what did Sam Shoemaker contribute that caused Bill to say we got all of our ideas from Sam Shoemaker, whether he was telling it accurately or not? Well, I'm not going to go through the Oxford group. We've just done that. First step. Oh, God, manage me. I can't manage myself. That's Shoemaker, Oxford, one and the same. But Sam made some very special contributions. One was the whole idea of spiritual misery. Spiritual misery, not drinking misery. And it didn't take Bill and Bob long to realize there was something wrong with the alcoholic besides drinking too much. He was a screwed up individual. And I'm not one of these people that says I was an alcoholic from the get-go and my life was miserable. It happens that my life was terrific. And then came the booze. And in law school came the sleeping pills. So I don't think we're the same in very many particulars, except we sure get hooked on drugs and booze. And once we get hooked, we can't get the hook out. But they concluded that we had a spiritual disease and that it would have to be miraculously removed. And that when that happened, it would vanish. Now, Ozzy showed me something that you're going to see in my next book, because old Ozzy is still plumbing away here, and he believes in a lot of the same things that I do. And he says, next year, Dick, the text is the golden text on page 191. And Bill Wilson said that he was grateful to the Lord for having cured him of alcohol. We're never cured. We only recover, and it's conditioned on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. That isn't the way they saw it. Spiritual problem, spiritual solution, miraculous cure. And then Bill does terrific writing when it comes to the plight of the drunk. I've never seen such great writing. I love Bill's story. You can teach the whole program from Bill's story. His description of us and what we do and what we don't do and what we can't do is absolutely marvelous. But this concept of the spiritual misery doesn't arise in the big book, really, until you get to the fourth step discussion. But here's what Shoemaker said in his very first book. Now, the thing which is striking about much of the misery that one sees is that it is spiritual misery. It is the sadness of maladjustment to the eternal things, and this throws out the whole focus of life. You know, I see these poor souls out on Maui. There they are in paradise. Handsome dudes and gals, and they look even better in swim trunks and bathing suits. And here they are wandering around, destroying their life, and then they get sober and it's even worse. And the spiritual sickness is the one that is the real tiger. Anybody, as Clarence used to say, can quit drinking. Anybody. Most everybody here has done it many times. The problem is we can't stay away from it. And it's they thought, spiritual sickness. And Shoemaker said it's a maladjustment to eternal things, meaning godly things, and this throws out the whole focus of life. Rest cures and exercise and motor drives will not help. Almost sounds like that chapter on More on Alcoholism, Take a trip, don't take a trip. Now, I've done all that stuff, swear off, don't swear off, and Stepping Stones is Bill's Bible that he took an oath on before he took his next drink. The only thing that will help is religion. For the root of the malady is estrangement from God, estrangement from Him in people that were made to be His companions. I think one of the most exciting things about the Bible and God is that God doesn't just want to be alone. He wants kids. And He wants to fellowship with the kids. And He wants to love them, and He wants them to love Him. Man, what a cool arrangement. That's pretty nice. And what's more, when we misbehave, He forgives us. Now, a lot of people in AA have fathers that don't ever want to see them again. Not God. So the root of the malady is the distance that we put between ourselves and God, whether we believe in Him or not. That's the spiritual problem. And he says then, for most men, the world is centered in self, which is misery. That's AA to the core. If you were listening to Joe and Charlie, they'd say, self, that's the problem. Self, the manifestations of self. They got that from the Oxford group, and they possibly know it. I'm sure they've read some of my books by now. Self, and it's misery. Remember in the big book where it says, driven by 100 forms of self-pity, self this, self that? What is it? We know we're not whole yet. And then Sam said, self-will seems the blackest sin of all. Rebellion against God, the only hell. So he was big on this stuff. Why would you want to find Him now, like the big book says? It's because it's hell without Him. That's what Sam wrote. Rebellion, always fighting to try and make things go your way. And then Sam wrote, God is God and self is not God. That is the heart of it. It's an actual fact that we become God to ourselves unless we have a God to believe in. The final reference becomes ourselves. And what does the big book say? Selfishness, self-centeredness. That, we think, is the root of our troubles, driven by 100 forms of self-pity and so forth. And egocentricity, what does that mean? I'm the center of the universe. I don't need nobody. Now I'm self-sufficient. And all of a sudden, everything hits the fan. And the quickest solution to that, get loaded. Spiritual misery. Sam was eloquent on that. And it was almost unique, that part of the Oxford group writing. Spiritual misery. The solution. A spiritual experience. A relationship with God. If you're estranged from Him, you come back to Him. Some of them have to find Him. But neither the term spiritual experience nor spiritual awakening can be attributed to Shoemaker alone. Frank Buchman used that expression. You can find spiritual experience, spiritual awakening. They're synonymous. You can find conversion experience, experience of God, experience of Christ, religious experience, conversion, born again. The Oxford group used all of these expressions. But what was it? Getting back into a relationship with God. And I wrote that in an early draft of one book, and this distinguished historian said, I deny it. It's not about establishing a relationship with God. And I wrote back and I said, try reading the big book. It says it there a half a dozen times.
Would you use William James as part of this story? William James?
Well,
writing about this.
He defined what a religious experience was, and Shoemaker quoted him a lot, which is probably one of the reasons Bill was so willing and anxious to read William James' variety of religious experiences, and probably one of the reasons that either Ebby or Roland Hazard gave him that book. Now, Sam, remember the problem is spiritual misery. The solution, a spiritual experience and relationship with God. Sam wrote, what you want is simply a vital religious experience. You need to find God. You need Jesus Christ. Then he wrote, that's in Realizing Religion, his first book, and then in Twice Born Ministers he wrote, the conspiracy of silence about sin, about deliverance, about spiritual experience has lasted long enough. This generation is frank about other things, and they want the truth about what God does for us. That's the message, isn't it? Now, he writes further in National Awakening. Do you think a moral and spiritual awakening might be the answer to our needs? President Angel of Yale believes that the fullness of life cannot be achieved through economic channels solely, but can come only from an awakening ethical and religious spirit. And the President of the United States, that's FDR, declares that he doubts if there is any problem, social, political, or economic, that would not melt away before the fire of such a spiritual awakening. Isn't that cool stuff? You know, the world doesn't revolve around Alcoholics Anonymous. Sometimes I think I live in a shell. I think the whole world is wrapped up in Alcoholics Anonymous. Great Scott, you ought to go to some of these treatment things I'm getting exposed to now. These people are sitting around there, they hardly even talk about Alcoholics Anonymous. They're talking about alcoholism, the drug war, the things that don't work, treatment, therapy, intervention, on and on, aversion therapy, diamphrazil, or whatever in the heck that stuff is. They don't even talk about us. This principle of a spiritual awakening, getting back into a relationship with God, touched Franklin D. Roosevelt to the point that he was saying any problem will melt in the face of a consciousness of the importance of God in your life. And then Shoemaker wrote in Children of the Second Birth, we believe entirely that conversion is the experience which initiates the new life. But we are not fools enough to think that the beginning is the end. All subsequent life is a development of a relationship with God which conversion opened. You see the pattern of the 12 steps there? You know, you make the decision in the third step. And what does the big book say? We were reborn. Boy, I'll bet they added that one out pretty soon, along with the word he. You know, we were reborn. But that's only the beginning. The guy who thinks he's got it made when he's taken the third step and forgets about the rest of it hasn't established his relationship with God. All he's done is become a misbehaving kid all of a sudden. And the rest of it is the big deal. And Shoemaker was writing that, and steps incorporate that concept. And boy, I bet you could say this to a bunch of old-timers, and they're, oh, what do you mean about that? I just do what I'm told, and then everything works out. Hey, this is a big deal working for God. This is tough stuff. And all subsequent life is about getting in fellowship with Him. And the steps offer a design for living. What's the design? Working out successfully that old first and second great commandments. Loving God, loving your neighbor as yourself. It's a tall order. Okay. So if spiritual misery is the problem, meaning we're separated from God, and spiritual experience is the solution, and it's not a personality change sufficient to overcome the disease of alcoholism. A spiritual experience was and is in the Oxford group, and a spiritual awakening was and is in the Oxford group, the reestablishing, the awakening, the commencement of a relationship with God. Therefore, Shoemaker wrote endlessly, including a pamphlet called How to Find God. That's what the steps are about, for those that didn't find Him. And you know they originally read that you had to find or rediscover Him. I never had any. One guy said at lunchtime he never got lost. Of course he didn't. But some of us have to find some kind of a belief and believe in God Some of us believed in God and got so far away from Him we even forgot He was available, or that we were supposed to be in harmony with Him. So, this "may you find Him now" is a later version of Bill, but on the other hand, Shoemaker was phrasing it in those terms. And here's what he said, and you'll find these terms in A.'s Big Book as well. God is or He isn't. Is that from the Big Book? No, that's from Shoemaker. The Big Book took it from Shoemaker. Let go, abandon yourself to Him. Say to Him, not thy will, but my will, but thine be done. Is that from the Big Book? Did the Bible take it from the Big Book? It came from the Bible, and Shoemaker said, let go, abandon yourself. That language is in our book. And not my will, but thine be done. Then Sam wrote, surrender to whatever you know about Him. It doesn't say surrender to whatever you know about a statue or a bulldozer. Surrender to whatever you know about Him or believe must be the truth about Him. That's in the Gospel according to you. And when you are helping and working with another to surrender, this means there will be opening of their minds to as much of God as He understood, allowing the Spirit to focus an impression upon the mind like light upon a camera exposed. Children of the Second Birth, page 47. Convince the person to surrender as much of himself as he could to as much of Christ as he understood. Children of the Second Birth, page 25. Then Shoemaker wrote in National Awakening, give in, admit that I am God, high over the nations. Psalm 46:10 as translated from Moffat. And then Shoemaker wrote in National Awakening, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. That's from the Sermon on the Mount. You must be born again. That's from John 3. A man is born again when the control of his life, its center and its direction, pass from himself to God. That was probably the origin of the Big Book ideas God either is or He isn't, and that one simply surrenders to as much of God as he understands, and that when he obeys God's will, he becomes conscious that God exists and knows from his experience what God has done for him. Does all this sound just nuts to you, or do you think that you have that you can relate it to Big Book language? I'm assuming and hoping that some of you know what's in the Big Book. I didn't for about 3 years. I couldn't even understand it. So, the two go hand in hand, and I think they help one to understand the other. Next thing, how to find God? Shoemaker, and really AA, say by an experiment of faith, based on John 7:17. This is a strange thing. The atheist comes in, and I was saying to the guy that brought me from the airport, I don't think there are any atheists. I think I said it here too. At least not in a foxhole. But the AA text addresses that question. Dr. Bob was not an atheist. Bill was. So there was an experiment for guys like Bill. And the chapter We Agnostics addresses that experiment. And it starts with willingness. And Shoemaker wasn't its only proponent. And willingness meant just get off your tail and start moving along godly lines. And then you'll find out. And Shoemaker wrote, we're talking about how to find God. Prayer is the heart of the discovery of the will of God, but that kind of prayer is impossible without radical and basic surrender to the will of God first. Get a receiving set. That's Dick. If any man willeth to do his will, and that's John 7:17, this means no grudging concession to God, but wholehearted and allegiance and the cooperation of one's whole self. Then, said Shoemaker, he will know. You know the language of the Big Book that says, can he take it? Take all of them? I always tell my sponsees, he doesn't want it. You just get rid of it. It's a problem. But anyway, Shoemaker then wrote, it lies, he said, you get this faith. It lies in believing that God is not that he isn't, that he has a plan, and that he will reveal that plan to us. It lies in fitting in with that plan ourselves and finding that God will take care of us when we dare to make the experiment. I was just in Pittsburgh, and one of the biggest deals in Pittsburgh, possibly the only major deal that Shoemaker brought there, was the Pittsburgh experiment. And he'd go out to this golf club crowd that I met with for about 2 hours and had dinner with a few of them. And I thought he preached to them. Oh, no way. But he would say to these people, have you brought God into your business life? And they probably all looked pretty sad. And then he'd say, I want you to try an experiment. I want you to pray for 30 days every day, and I want you to meet together and pray together and see what happens. That was the Pittsburgh experiment in simpler terms. And it's consistent with what he was right. Prayer is the heart of the discovery of the will of God. If you want to get your life straightened out, start praying. And start praying together. And early AAs did. And you believe that God is, that he has a plan, he'll reveal the plan, and then fit in with the plan yourself, and you'll find God will take care of you. And if you don't conform yourself to the plan, you'll probably drink. He didn't say that. There were, said Shoemaker, 3 basic elements in making this experiment to find God. The first is belief in God. That's why Dr. Bob used to say to the newcomer, do you believe in God, young fella? And there was only one answer. I ask that to every newcomer that I meet. And I've done it for 12 years, and I've never had anybody say no. Of course, they're scared to, and they're liars. But anyway, they do say yes. There has to be, first, a belief in God. Well, then there are those guys that don't. And so you got a loophole. You start with willingness to believe, and here's how he defines that. The second thing is utter preoccupation with God's plan. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. First things first is seeking God first. That's what Shoemaker taught. That's what Dr. Bob taught. And that's the essence of the step plan. You go after God's will, and then you find out who God is, because it works. That's why it works. If you don't go after his will, it isn't going to work. It didn't work for the Jewish people. Every time they got screwed up and walked away, which they frequently did, they got in deep doo-doo. And then God would come and speak to some prophet, and he'd say, tell these people they're off base. And so back they'd come again, and things would start getting better. That's the story, of the whole Exodus, the whole Jewish movement, was the inflow and outflow from God and his will. Things go better with God. Maybe that's where Coca-Cola got that. The third thing is that God can tell you your part in that plan. Now, one major religion doesn't believe that. That was the reason for the hostility of the Oxford group. They believe you need an intermediary. But the Oxford group didn't. And hopefully AA doesn't. Remember, first you got to have a receiving set, but once you got it, and the receiving set is spirit, once you got it, he talks to you. And that's why they said the Bible is full of instances. And what are we talking about in the 11th step when we talk about on awakening, we ask him? And if you want to look through some of my books, you'll see endless examples of the big book talking about asking God for guidance. Well, there's no use asking him if he isn't listening. And there's no use expecting him to listen if he isn't. He either is or he isn't. And if he is, you start with that belief, and then you preoccupy yourself with his will, and God will tell you a little bit more about how to proceed. Then Shoemaker wrote, that's how to find God. The next one is how to know the will of God. Oh, I wonder what his will for me is. Why don't you pick up his word? Once you have surrendered, the promise was in the Sermon on the Mount. Not every one that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of God, but he that doeth the will of my Father who is in heaven. Matthew 7:31. The underlying starting philosophy is do the will of God, and things are going to go pretty well with you. And you're also going to find out about him. Then Shoemaker wrote, if you're wondering why we're talking about the Bible, we find God's general will in the Scriptures. That's why they read the Bible. And then he said, we want something much more direct. Must have been alcoholics he was talking about. Don't give me the Bible, give me the straight scoop. We want to know that God can and does speak directly to the human heart. The reason why some of us believe in guidance, at least in theory, is that the Old and New Testaments are as full of instances of it as specific as you please. And they sure are. Eventually, one of the fun things about reading the Bible is it's a storybook. Truthful storybook. And it tells how God guided the children of Israel through all kinds of troubles whenever they turned to Him. And there are endless examples. Where in the world do you suppose the expression, the Word of God, comes from? Well, one of the fun things that I was doing in those 33 days in prison was answering that question for a guy who finally got out and did just fine after 12 years. Zephaniah just opened it to this. The word of the Lord which came unto Zephaniah. That's why they said that there are endless examples. You just pick up the Bible. The word of the Lord which came unto Zephaniah. Here's Jonah. Now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah. God was speaking to those people. And the Oxford group believed He would speak to people today. And so does AA if they stop calling Him a bulldozer. You know. That's what the thesis of the 11th step is. Sought through prayer and meditation to establish contact. Why ring a phone if it's not working? You know, it must work. Okay. But first you look in the Scriptures for God's general will, said Shoemaker. What's His general will? Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. The greatest thing is love. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, and so forth. But we want something more direct, he said, and that's guidance. Then he said, the one thing in religion that matters most, a real hold on God and a real knowledge of His will by genuine revelation. God revealed every word in the Bible, and they called it the Word of Word of God, which came to Humpty Dump, and the Word of God, which came to Humpty Dump. And so they wrote it down because He told them to write it down. And then, when man would get in the soup, in the specific areas, He'd speak to them by revelation because they had receiving sets. Shoemaker wrote, surrender to God's will, which is the heart of faith, is summed up in the question, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? Boy, has that changed my life. Then he says we got to wipe the slate clean and then ask Him to write His will upon it. That's clearing out the receiver. God, give us the grace to ask, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? That's from 3 different books. Always writing the same thing. And then he wrote in the Conversion of the Church, which has a lot of stuff that seems to have found its way directly into AA. Religion today is largely the imitation of an example when it ought to be the hearing of a voice. You know, live like Jesus did on the Sermon on the Mount. Well, you're not God, and you're not Jesus, and you're not perfect. But you can hear from God, they said. And then he uses this verse that he used a lot. What Eli said to Samuel that day is the last word in spiritual advice. Thou shalt climb on a bulldozer. No. It says, thou shalt say, speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. There is active faith. There is active faith. And the listening attitude and the patience which waits for the emergence of God's plan, all wrapped up in one. And, you know, this idea was very helpful to Bill Wilson. It caused him, whether he lived it or not, to believe that when you turned your will and your life over to God's care, you'd hear from Him. You'd hear from Him. He'd tell you what to do. And it starts with the idea, tell me what to do. And Shoemaker then it was, you have to give it away to keep it. And he said that a lot. And he wrote these things. And this one's quoted in Ann's book. The only way to keep religion is to give it away. Give what you can right away. It'll increase as you give it. And he wrote, the best way to keep what you have is to give it away. And no substitute has ever been found for personal Christian witness. And he wrote, we must begin giving away what we have or we shall lose it. And then he wrote, get them into the stream of God's will and God's grace till they ask Him to use them to help reconcile others. They will not keep this unless they give it away. You know, maybe we think this was something original. It came from somebody down in Texas in an AA meeting. No, it came from Sam Shoemaker. So he gave us these principles, Sam did, that we have a spiritual malady or spiritual misery, which is separation from God, and we need to have a spiritual experience, which is getting back to God. That means we need to find Him, so he told us how to find Him, and that is surrender. And then he told us how to surrender by the experiment of faith, which is to do as much as you can, and you'll know, and start out by believing that God is. And then if you want to know the will of God, read His Word, and also learn how to talk to Him. And then once you learn, you got to give it away to keep it. And so Shoemaker was really about from a spiritual malady to a spiritual experience. And frankly, it'd be fun someday if I ever had the time and they had the time to sit down with Joe and Charlie and see what they think about all this stuff. I know one thing, Charlie said, Dick, you can give your books at any place that I speak as long as the local committee approves. If we lose what we have, we're goners. And I came down to Joe's place, and he said, give Dick everything we have here. This message needs to get out. And, you know, I find those men have been very influential in my life, not in a spiritual way, but in terms of learning the big book and the sacrifice that they do. And they give it away to keep it. But the refreshing thing has been that they're open to more information, not closed. And it is about, this isn't the way they teach the big book, but it's the way I see the AA program in light of its roots. And one day I was sitting at lunch with Joe McHugh in Little Rock. And he says, Dick, the whole program is from step 1 to step 2, from powerlessness to power. And that probably helped me more than anything I've ever heard from an AA. And that is, that's the whole thing, you know. We're in a mess. We need to get out of the mess. We don't have any power. We need power. And then the rest of the stuff is about how we get, use, implement, and give away that power message to somebody else. And in the Gospel According to You, which I've never been able to get a copy of, I was able to copy a copy, you'll see the whole spiritual journey, almost as if Bill were writing it, except Sam wrote it. And you'll see it also in Bill's story in the big book. You know, I think it's on page 8, and by the way, it was called to my attention. I made a mistake this morning, which is a very rare thing. But our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us, is on page 77 of the third edition. And now I got to get back to my point, where whatever in the world it was. I know it was very significant. Bill's story. And I learned this from the Big Book seminars. I think it's on page 8. Bill takes the first step, said Joe and Charlie. And he says, alcohol had become my master. And then, of course, he drank. We all do that, you know. We get whipped, and what do? Go back to it for more. That's part of the insanity of the show. And it's there, and then Ebby comes to visit Bill, and he says, I got religion, and Bill wanted to puke. And then Ebby stood his ground. He says, Bill, God's done for me what I couldn't do for myself, And Bill says that statement hit me hard. He needed to hear from somebody a real message, not just baloney. Don't drink and go to meetings. Won't cut it. It may get you into AA, but the real message was God has done for me what I couldn't do for myself. And then comes another visit from Ebby, and he says, I was down there at the rescue mission, and Bill says, well, we might as well start this thing right. And he came in there drunk, and he says, Ebby got sober here, I want to do what he did. And he did it differently. Bill said he'd given his life to Christ a dozen times to get free cups of coffee. But this time it was a different show. Ebby had witnessed to him. Ebby was well, Bill was sick. It was one of the few times that Ebby was well. But he was well, and Bill was sick. And Bill wanted what he had. Bill must have been a little crazier than we thought, but, he did. He saw his friend, and his friend stood his ground. So Bill didn't go get a big book that wasn't written. Bill didn't go get a Bible because he didn't know what was in it. So he goes back to the rescue mission, which was run by Sam Shoemaker, and he goes to the altar and makes a decision for Christ. Then what does he do? He goes into the hospital, and to be doubly sure of where he's going, Ebby comes back and says, now you got to take these steps. And there weren't any steps, but he describes them. And in Turning Point, they're laid out in real deep detail and wonderful explanations. This is in Bill's manuscripts, which never quite made it into the big book. But they're there. They're at stepping stones. And Ebby explains to him, says Bill, in great detail, how to take these steps of humbly offering yourself to God and taking a moral inventory and telling somebody else about it and being convinced that you need to change and being reborn and then making restitution. And then Ebby comes back and he says, that's not enough, Bill. You got to have a spiritual experience. Well, Bill already had, but Bill did it up brown, and he makes these steps, and then he says, the cold, clean wind of the mountain. Maybe there was a door open and Bill was having hallucinations. I don't know. And I'm not making fun. I'm saying that that's what a lot of people have concluded. I don't know. Bill may have had a very keen consciousness of the power and presence of God in his life. Why not? He'd already made a decision. And so whatever happened, maybe he just got a little godly for once, and he did feel the power and presence. And many of you maybe have had that experience. When you really start doing things right, when you really try to, do you want what I have, and are you willing to go to any lengths to get it? And you say, yeah, I've had enough. These two guys that are living in my house, I'm checking with Bob here to see what's going on. And, I think these guys might make it. They're working together, and both of them have had enough. Well, so have a lot of people out there, but these two guys are starting on a different path. And as that path gets wider, not narrower, they begin more and more to see what God is doing for them. And Bill had this electric experience. Nobody else was having it. So then they wrote the spiritual appendix, and, you don't need to have that. You can just have an educational one. Well, maybe that's the story. As we move along in accordance with God's plan, we become more and more conscious of what He's doing for us. That's not hard for me to understand. So that's it. And tonight we're going to cover Ann Smith. And I'll just buy a little time here and say this. The saddest thing, you go back to Founders Day, and it'll be on sometime June 10th, somewhere around there, in Akron. And on the stage, there'll be a picture of Bill, and a picture of Bob, and a picture of Sister Ignatia, and no picture of Ann Smith, no picture of T. Henry and Clarice, no picture of Henrietta Sarvely, none of Dick's books anymore in Dr. Bob's home. The only book that's sold there, other than the kids' book, is Sister Ignatia. And it's sad to me And I guess maybe that's why Dr. Bob's son and I and his wife are so close, is because Dick, he says, you seem to be the only person that really wants to tell people about Ann. And you bet I do. Because she was not only an extraordinary person, and Bill called her the mother of AA, he called her a founder of AA, and Al-Anons, when they, in their main office, when they read my books, they say, we need to know more about Annie. And if you read her journal, you'll see she was talking to women. Also, Anne was a counselor to families as well as alkies. And Clarence Snyder often said that he could say things to Ann Smith that he couldn't say to Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob was very stern and very quiet and very demanding. You didn't argue with Dr. Bob. He told you what to do. And these poor drunks needed some love and some special care. Maybe that's why a lot of them stayed so long in the Smith home. Dr. Bob wasn't always around that much, but Ann was, and she gave everything. The kids were stuck in the attic. The drunks were stuck in the beds and everywhere. And so the immense influence that this lady had on recovery and the principles of recovery lies not alone in the fact that so many people loved her and that she was at all the meetings, but that she also was studying and teaching the Bible, attending every Oxford group meeting, reading the literature, and writing it down, and she had been a teacher. And so she taught. And it took a lot of tooth pulling to get that information out. Ann Smith's journal was buried away. There was a copy at Stepping Stones, and they claim I stole it. It's still there. I don't know how that one came about. But there was a copy at Stepping Stones, and it's the better copy because it's also got Soul Surgery and Confidence Faith, at least it did 5 years ago, in the back, so you can see why these Oxford groups books were important. But there's one in New York, and nobody had ever reported anything about it. The lady that wrote Sister Ignatia is the one that tipped me off. It says, AA leaps out of its pages. Well, why didn't anybody write about it? It does leap out of its pages, and maybe tonight I'll have you leaping, I don't know. But it's fantastic what this lady contributed, and we finally found the history that she contributed to AA's. She read from her journal. So here you have from 1933, before there was an AA, to 1939, when the big book came out, a journal, the only real record of the steps they took. And it's a textbook, it's a description, it covers the Oxford group, it covers the Bible, and you cover yourself over and have a nice nap this afternoon, a nice dinner, and we'll see you tonight and talk about Ann Smith.